Matthew drove through the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, his grip on the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white, feeling the crushing weight of a life that had completely unraveled. For months, he had been trapped in a suffocating cycle, leaving his sprawling, empty house before dawn and returning long after dark from his rapidly expanding import business. He spent 14 or 15 hours a day, buried in endless contracts, international shipping disputes, and grueling meetings that drained every ounce of joy from his existence. After his wife, Jessica, packed her bags and left a brief handwritten note stating she could no longer endure the suffocating loneliness of being married to a ghost, Matthew was thrust into a nightmare of single fatherhood. He was left entirely alone to manage a booming company he could not simply abandon, and two toddler twins, who never seemed to stop crying. Desperately demanding an emotional presence he simply did not know how to provide. His massive home, once a symbol of his hard-earned corporate success, had transformed into a chaotic battleground where peace was a forgotten concept. In the span of just 2 months, Matthew had desperately hired 5 different nannies, offering premium salaries, yet every single one of them had quit in less than 14 days. Benjamin and Caleb, his twin boys, were undeniably hyperactive, aggressively stubborn, and profoundly traumatized by their mother's sudden disappearance, expressing their confusion by refusing meals, fighting bath time, and screaming through the night. Every evening, Matthew would walk through his front door, utterly exhausted, his bones aching from the stress of corporate logistics, only to be met with shattered vases, wailing children, and frustrated caregivers handing in their immediate resignations. Then, exactly 3 days ago, Grace walked through his front door in response to an online advertisement he had posted in a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation. She was young, perhaps 26 or 27 years old, dressed in modest, unassuming clothes, and spoke with a calm, melodic softness that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the household. During the incredibly brief, fragmented interview, which Matthew conducted while simultaneously fielding 2 urgent phone calls regarding delayed freight shipments from overseas, there was something distinctly remarkable about the way she looked at his screaming sons. When Benjamin furiously hurled a plastic cup of juice across the hardwood floor and Caleb began to wail at the top of his lungs, Grace did not flinch, sigh, or look toward the door. She merely offered a warm, grounded smile, looked Matthew directly in the eyes, and calmly asked if she could start her shift right that very second. Matthew accepted her offer without a second thought, his mind already racing back to the imminent threat of a multi-million-dollar contract cancellation with a major supplier in Asia. Over the next 3 days, he barely even saw Grace, maintaining his brutal routine of leaving the house before 6 in the morning and dragging himself back inside well after 11 at night. He would find the house immaculately clean, the boys sound asleep in their beds, and a simple, neatly handwritten note on the kitchen counter informing him that they had eaten their dinner, taken their baths, and were doing just fine. He continued his soul-crushing corporate grind, blindly assuming he had finally stumbled upon a resilient worker who could simply tolerate the exhausting physical demands of the job, completely oblivious to the profound shift happening under his own roof. However, everything changed on a dreary Thursday afternoon, when an unprecedented anomaly occurred in Matthew's rigidly scheduled corporate life. A crucial executive meeting was abruptly canceled at the very last minute, and a major international client indefinitely postponed their project presentation, unexpectedly leaving Matthew with a free afternoon for the first time in over 8 months. Sitting in his downtown Seattle office, listening to the rain tap against the glass, he made the spontaneous decision to drive home early, harboring a fragile, guilt-ridden hope that he might be able to share a decent meal with his children and pretend to be a present father, if only for a few fleeting hours. As his car pulled into the driveway at exactly 4 in the afternoon, a strange, unfamiliar silence hung over the property, making his heart hammer against his ribs with sudden, irrational anxiety. He unlocked the heavy front door and stepped quietly into the hallway, fully bracing himself for the usual symphony of crashing toys and high-pitched screams that normally greeted his arrivals. Instead, he heard the faint, incredibly rare sound of genuine, uninhibited giggling echoing down the corridor, a sound so alien to his recent reality that he actually froze in his tracks, wondering if he had walked into the wrong house. Matthew cautiously approached the entrance of the sprawling kitchen and found himself completely paralyzed by a scene that defied every logical expectation he had cultivated over the past year. Grace was standing at the edge of the massive marble countertop, her sleeves rolled up, casually washing a mountain of dishes with her hands deeply submerged in thick, white soap suds. Benjamin was happily perched on a sturdy stool right behind her, his tiny arms wrapped securely around her neck, laughing with a pure, infectious joy that Matthew had entirely forgotten his son was even capable of producing. Caleb was stationed right beside her, his cheeks and messy hair delightfully smeared with white foam, sporting the kind of massive, authentic smile that young children only reveal when they feel entirely safe and deeply happy. Grace was softly humming a sweet, rhythmic folk song about little birds flying across a clear blue sky, carefully maneuvering the wet plates to ensure she didn't accidentally splash the boys too much. The twins were utterly mesmerized by the iridescent soap bubbles drifting gracefully through the warm kitchen air. Benjamin was eagerly trying to snatch them with his tiny hands, while Caleb let out a booming giggle every single time a bubble popped softly against his soapy nose. Matthew remained anchored to the floorboards at the kitchen threshold, his chest tightening with an overwhelming, suffocating mixture of awe and profound sorrow, as he observed this alternate universe where his children were actually tranquil and joyous. "Look, Dad! Look at me, Dad!" Benjamin suddenly shrieked at the top of his lungs when his eyes finally darted toward the doorway and registered his father's unexpected presence. Grace violently flinched, spinning around with a look of absolute terror masking her gentle features, her soapy hands slipping and nearly sending a heavy ceramic dinner plate crashing onto the expensive hardwood floor. Her pale cheeks instantly flushed, a deep, embarrassed crimson, adopting the posture of an employee who had just been caught committing a terrible, unforgivable mistake while on the clock. "Mr. Matthew, I swear I wasn't expecting you to be home this early, and I am so incredibly sorry for this terrible mess in the kitchen," she stammered rapidly, hurriedly wiping her hands on a nearby towel. Matthew could clearly see the sheer panic in her wide eyes, realizing she fully expected him to unleash a furious tirade for allowing his children to play amidst soapy water and dirty dishes instead of keeping them isolated in their designated playroom. "No, please. It is not that at all," Matthew finally managed to say, his voice emerging as a thick, gravelly whisper that felt entirely stuck in the back of his dry throat. I honestly was not expecting to walk in and see this," he continued, struggling to string his words together coherently because he possessed no vocabulary to explain the gaping hole in his chest. They seem so incredibly happy right now," he whispered, unable to finish his original thought, because confronting the reality that he hadn't seen his own flesh and blood smile like this in nearly a year was too painful to articulate. Grace released a long, trembling sigh of profound relief, a soft, cautious smile slowly returning to her lips as Caleb aggressively tugged at her wet sleeve, desperately begging for her to resume the bubble-making process. She reached over and grabbed a clean, damp cloth, tenderly wiping a large dollop of foam from Caleb's chin, before turning her warm gaze back to Matthew. "I just figured it would be significantly easier for their little hearts if I allowed them to actively participate in the daily chores I have to do around the house," she explained gently. "They become so much calmer and more regulated when they actually feel like they are a valuable part of the environment, rather than just being left all alone in a room with their toys." Those simple, unpretentious words struck Matthew's chest with the devastating force of a physical blow, completely shattering the fragile illusions he had built around his parenting. He realized with sickening clarity that isolating them was exactly what he had been doing ever since Jessica abandoned them. He had been leaving his grieving sons entirely alone, outsourcing their emotional care to a rotating cast of strangers who merely executed basic survival tasks without ever attempting to forge a genuine human connection. "Dad, look at my hands," Benjamin squealed, proudly thrusting his suds-covered palms into the air and laughing with a bright, ringing enthusiasm that instantly brought hot tears to the corners of Matthew's exhausted eyes. In that singular, defining moment, Matthew felt a massive, invisible wall crumble inside his soul. A barricade heavily fortified by endless corporate excuses, endless spreadsheets, and deeply ingrained fears of his own inadequacy as a father. He stepped slowly toward the marble island, his expensive leather shoes squeaking softly against the floor, and Grace instinctively took a respectful step backward, gracefully yielding her space so the towering man could finally be close to his own sons. Matthew tentatively extended a shaking hand, gently resting his palm against Caleb's wildly messy, soap-crusted hair, and the young boy peered up at him with massive, brilliant eyes overflowing with an innocent, breathtaking curiosity. "Do you want to play bubbles with us, Dad?" Caleb asked, his tiny, fragile voice trembling with a desperate, beautiful hope that caused a massive lump to form instantly in Matthew's throat. Unable to verbally formulate a response without openly weeping, Matthew simply nodded his head aggressively, reaching into the stainless steel sink to grab a bright yellow sponge, vigorously squeezing it until a mountain of thick bubbles erupted between his fingers. The boys screamed with absolute delight, their joyful voices echoing off the high ceilings, while Grace quietly resumed washing the remaining dishes right beside them, a tender, knowing smile permanently etched onto her face. They remained stationed at that kitchen counter for nearly 1 hour, completely losing track of time in a chaotic symphony of flying water, popping bubbles, and booming, contagious laughter. Matthew lost count of how many times his chest ached with that bizarre, overwhelming concoction of profound happiness for the present moment, and agonizing, suffocating guilt for the countless months he had foolishly squandered. When the very last dish was finally rinsed and stacked, Grace smoothly produced a stack of warm, fluffy towels, meticulously and lovingly drying each of the boys' tiny fingers with a patience so divine it bordered on the miraculous. Matthew stood frozen, watching this young woman, who had known his broken children for a mere 3 days, effortlessly weave a bond of trust and affection that he, their biological father, had entirely failed to establish. "Grace," Matthew called out softly over the lingering giggles of the twins, watching as she immediately lifted her gaze to meet his, her expression remarkably attentive and open. "How exactly do you do this? How on earth do you manage to keep them so unbelievably calm and happy when everyone else ran away screaming?" Grace paused, her hands resting gently on the damp towel, taking several long seconds to carefully formulate her thoughts before offering him a response. "I truly believe they just desperately need to feel that someone is actually fully present with them," she said softly. "Not just keeping them alive or watching them from a distance, but being genuinely engaged, actually paying deep attention to the massive emotions they are struggling to carry inside." Matthew nodded his head in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, feeling the immense gravity of her profound wisdom settle heavily over his tired shoulders. He knew, with absolute certainty, that she was entirely correct. He had spent so much of his life obsessively analyzing profit margins and shipping manifests that he had entirely forgotten to look at his sons as small, grieving humans who required his physical and emotional presence far more than they required a lavish Seattle mansion or a massive trust fund. Benjamin aggressively yanked on the hem of Matthew's expensive dress shirt, looking up with wide, hopeful eyes, and asked, "Dad, are you actually going to eat dinner with us tonight?" That devastatingly innocent question pierced Matthew's soul, highlighting the absolute absurdity of his life, that his own young son had to verbally inquire if his father would bother sticking around for a basic family meal. "I absolutely am," Matthew replied, his voice suddenly echoing with a fierce, unwavering determination that surprised even himself. I am going to eat dinner with you guys tonight, and I will eat dinner with you tomorrow, and I am going to be here every single time that I possibly can." Benjamin's face instantly erupted into a blindingly bright smile, and the boy threw his tiny arms around Matthew's leg, squeezing with all his might, while Caleb rapidly mirrored the action, fiercely clinging to his father's other leg. Matthew felt a hot, stinging sensation behind his eyes as he finally comprehended the magnitude of the precious, irreplaceable moments he had willfully thrown away during his long months of emotional absence. Grace seamlessly transitioned into preparing the evening meal, moving around the kitchen with a quiet grace, while Matthew actively remained in the room, desperately eager to assist in any way he could. He found himself clumsily peeling potatoes right next to Benjamin, hilariously trying to mimic his son's erratic, exaggerated movements, while Caleb meticulously organized the chopped vegetables into crooked, towering piles on the edge of the cutting board. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Matthew felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. He was exactly where he was always meant to be, doing the only work that genuinely mattered in this world. The dinner they shared was incredibly modest. Simple bowls of steaming white rice, tender black beans, shredded roast chicken, and a fresh green salad. Yet, as Matthew sat at the head of that wooden table, listening to the chaotic, overlapping stories his sons told about their day, their silly games, and the magical fairy tales Grace had woven for them, it tasted like the greatest feast he had consumed in years. These were the microscopic, beautiful details of their innocent lives that he had remained entirely oblivious to, simply because he had never bothered to pull up a chair and listen. After the plates were cleared, Grace began diligently wiping down the kitchen surfaces. But Matthew firmly stepped into her path and said, "Please, let me handle the rest of this. You have been working incredibly hard all day long." Grace gently shook her head, a soft, reassuring smile on her lips, as she replied, "No, sir. I am perfectly happy to take care of this mess. You should absolutely go and spend a little more time with them if you want to." Matthew immediately recognized that she was intentionally gifting him a precious opportunity, carving out a sacred space for him to aggressively reclaim the vital father-son connection he had lost. He graciously accepted her gift, leading Benjamin and Caleb into the massive living room, where they excitedly retrieved a colorful storybook that Grace had thoughtfully purchased for them at a small, independent bookstore down the street. Matthew sat comfortably on the plush sofa, sandwiched securely between his two warm, heavily breathing children, and read 3 consecutive stories with more dramatic flair and enthusiasm than he had ever mustered in a corporate boardroom. Benjamin slowly succumbed to sleep right in the middle of the second adventurous tale, his small head resting heavily against Matthew's ribs, while Caleb valiantly fought his drooping eyelids until the very last sentence of the 3rd book. When Matthew finally gathered them into his arms, carrying them down the quiet hallway and tucking them securely into their respective beds, they were breathing with that deep, rhythmic, beautiful tranquility that only belongs to children who feel entirely safe and fiercely loved. He quietly padded back into the kitchen, finding Grace meticulously hanging the final dry dish towel on a small metal rack, her face displaying signs of physical exhaustion, but radiating a deep, undeniable satisfaction. Matthew pulled out one of the tall wooden bar stools, gesturing warmly for her to take a seat opposite him across the smooth marble island. "Grace, I really need to sincerely thank you," he began, his voice thick with unfeigned gratitude, though she immediately raised a hand to modestly brush the compliment away. "No, I am completely serious," he pressed on, leaning forward. "You need to fully understand that what you have accomplished with my boys in a mere 3 days vastly exceeds what 5 highly paid professionals failed to do in several weeks. You didn't just babysit them, you genuinely cared for their broken hearts." Grace lowered her gaze to the marble countertop, her cheeks flushing with a deep, modest pink, as she nervously traced the faint gray veins in the stone, before finally answering him. "I genuinely adore them, sir. They are truly incredible little boys who just desperately needed a tiny bit of focused attention and unconditional warmth," she murmured softly. Matthew nodded emphatically, entirely agreeing with her assessment, and before they knew it, they found themselves engaged in a deep, sprawling conversation that stretched for nearly 2 hours. Matthew asked about her past, her origins, and how a woman so young possessed such a profound, almost magical intuition when it came to healing fractured children. Grace slowly began to unravel her history, explaining how she grew up rapidly in a tough neighborhood, forced to act as a surrogate mother to her younger siblings after her own mother had to take on 2 exhausting jobs just to keep food on their modest table. She softly recounted the painful memory of her father walking out the front door when she was merely 9 years old, abandoning her struggling mother with 4 young children to raise entirely alone. She explained how, from a heartbreakingly young age, she had to manufacture her own maturity, stepping up to the plate simply because survival demanded it, and there was absolutely no one else available to carry the heavy burden. With a quiet, resilient pride, she described waking up consistently at 5 in the morning to prepare massive batches of oatmeal and toast for her siblings, before sprinting to catch the public bus for high school. She talked about fiercely guarding their study time, doing her own homework late at night, and learning to cook elaborate meals by closely observing her exhausted mother during the rare, fleeting moments they shared between overlapping work shifts. She had flawlessly morphed into a second mother for those 3 young ones, never once complaining or asking to assume such a massive, life-altering responsibility, but embracing it fiercely because her deep love for her family eclipsed her own childhood desires. My siblings grew up to be wonderful people. They are all dedicated to their studies. 2 are already thriving in college, and the youngest one finally finishes high school this year, Grace said, her voice swelling with a rich, undeniable pride. My mother thankfully secured a significantly better job about 3 years ago, so she doesn't have to break her back quite as much anymore, which is why I finally decided it was time to move out and try to build my own life. But it is honestly so difficult to detach. I still worry obsessively about whether they are eating enough vegetables or if they are studying hard enough for their final exams. She let out a bright, self-deprecating laugh, clearly acknowledging her own tendency to over-worry, but Matthew listened to every single syllable with absolute, captivated attention. He realized that Grace possessed a rare, breathtakingly profound wisdom about the mechanics of human connection. A wisdom not born from expensive university degrees or elite childhood education seminars, but forged in the fiery crucible of lived experience and unconditional, sacrificial love. You are an incredibly remarkable human being, Grace, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart, Matthew said, watching her face bloom into that familiar, endearing shade of red once again. You managed to make all of this look so effortless, so deeply natural, while I have been standing here completely paralyzed, unable to figure out how to have a basic conversation with my own flesh and blood, he confessed with brutal honesty. Grace firmly shook her head, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, unwavering sincerity that made his breath catch slightly in his throat. It is not that it is easy, Matthew. It is simply that I learned the hard way that a child desperately needs to feel that you are anchored in their reality, that you care about their internal pain, not just their external behavior. Benjamin and Caleb are spectacular boys, but they were entirely lost in a dark forest, deeply confused about why their mother vanished and why their father was constantly chained to an office desk. She explained her philosophy with such a calm, rhythmic cadence that the mysteries of parenting suddenly felt completely obvious, fundamentally altering the way Matthew viewed his entire existence. By the time the large grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, Grace quietly mentioned that she needed to gather her things because she lived quite far away and had to catch 2 separate night buses just to reach her modest apartment. In that fleeting moment, Matthew felt a massive, undeniable surge of absolute clarity, an impulsive, burning necessity to alter the trajectory of their lives that he didn't fully comprehend but knew he had to act upon. Grace, tell me exactly how much money I am currently paying you to work here, he asked directly, a commanding yet gentle tone in his voice that caused her to blink in mild confusion before she recited the modest weekly figure they had originally agreed upon. Matthew fiercely shook his head. "Starting tomorrow morning, that specific amount is going to be instantly doubled, and I need you to move into this house. There is a beautiful, fully furnished bedroom at the back of the property that is completely empty. You will no longer waste 4 hours a day sitting on dangerous public transit, and you will finally have time to breathe." Grace's eyes widened to the size of saucers, completely overwhelmed. "Sir, I absolutely cannot accept that. It is entirely too much. I am merely doing the job I was hired to do," she protested weakly. But Matthew remained an immovable mountain of resolve. "It is the absolute bare minimum I can offer the woman who is saving my children's lives. Please, just say yes." After several agonizing seconds of heavy silence, tears breached her eyelashes, and she nodded slowly, whispering a profound, trembling thank you that forever cemented her place in their home. The subsequent days completely obliterated the suffocating, miserable reality Matthew had endured since Jessica walked out the door, replacing the crushing darkness with a vibrant, unfamiliar light. He fiercely enforced a brand new corporate boundary, aggressively leaving his downtown Seattle office by 7 in the evening, instead of lingering until 11, deliberately racing the sunset so he could walk through his front door in time for family dinner. He immersed himself in the loud, chaotic tales of the boys' daily adventures, happily assisting Grace with the mundane, beautiful chores of drawing warm bubble baths and meticulously selecting matching socks for the following morning. Benjamin and Caleb completely transformed. Instead of screaming in terror, they began eagerly anticipating his arrival, sprinting down the grand hallway the absolute second they heard the heavy garage door opening. They would launch their tiny bodies directly into his waiting arms, shrieking, "Dad is home," with a pure, unadulterated ecstasy that only innocent children can truly manifest. Every single time those little arms wrapped around his neck, Matthew felt a painful, bittersweet squeeze in his chest, mourning the countless magical evenings he had foolishly sacrificed on the altar of his booming import business. By the end of that transformative week, Grace officially relocated her life into the sprawling Seattle home, arriving with nothing more than 2 battered suitcases filled with simple clothing and a small stack of heavily worn paperback books. Matthew personally assisted her in setting up the spacious back bedroom, thoroughly ensuring she was equipped with a brand new, ultra-comfortable mattress, layers of freshly laundered blankets, and a beautiful oak desk where she could study or read in absolute peace. She practically drowned him in repeated, tearful apologies and expressions of gratitude, but Matthew repeatedly anchored her with the truth, insisting that this arrangement was merely cosmic justice, the only correct path forward for someone who was single-handedly resurrecting his family. As the first month transitioned into the second, the massive house settled into a gorgeous, rhythmic equilibrium that Matthew had previously believed was scientifically impossible to achieve. He ruthlessly slashed his office hours even further, finally trusting the highly expensive corporate team he had hired to manage the intricate logistics of international shipping, an act of delegation he had previously been too paranoid to execute. He transitioned to working from his home office 2 days a week, a revolutionary schedule that finally permitted him to eat messy, loud lunches with his sons, and granted him the spectacular privilege of teaching Benjamin the complex art of tying shoelaces, or helping Caleb patiently snap together a massive cardboard puzzle. Through it all, Grace continued executing her daily responsibilities with an unwavering, angelic dedication. But Matthew now found himself mesmerized by the microscopic, brilliant details of her character that he had previously been too blind to notice. He noticed how she strategically placed the boys' absolute favorite toys on the lower shelves so they could feel empowered to reach them independently. How her voice instinctively shifted into a soft, melodic lullaby whenever the energy in the room grew too frantic. And how she possessed a seemingly infinite reservoir of patience for Benjamin's relentless, rapid-fire questions about the universe. He watched her fiercely embrace Caleb every single time. The loud, sudden rumble of the massive washing machine triggered a brief moment of irrational panic in the young boy's chest. One rainy Seattle afternoon, while Matthew was sequestered in his home office, meticulously reviewing a stack of complex vendor contracts, a soft, incredibly serious conversation drifting from the adjacent living room violently hijacked his attention. It was Grace, sitting on the plush carpet with the twins, gently navigating a profoundly heavy discussion about their big, scary emotions, validating their sadness, and fiercely reminding them that they could eternally rely on both her and their father. Matthew completely abandoned his lucrative paperwork, standing frozen by the cracked door, his breath caught in his throat as he eavesdropped on this remarkably simple, yet profoundly necessary emotional surgery. "Is our mom ever going to come back home?" Benjamin asked, his fragile voice trembling with an ancient, deeply rooted sorrow that caused Matthew's heart to shatter into a million jagged pieces, because it was the one terrifying question he absolutely did not know how to answer. Jessica had become a complete ghost since the morning she drove away. She had never dialed his number, never sent a single text message, entirely erasing herself from the narrative of their lives, as though the boys were merely a bad dream she had woken up from. Grace allowed a heavy, respectful silence to hang in the air for several seconds before answering, her voice trembling with a fierce, protective love. "I honestly do not know the answer to that, my sweet Benjamin, but what I know with absolute, unshakable certainty is that you and Caleb have a father who loves you with a passion that burns brighter than the sun. A man who is doing absolutely everything in his human power to be right here with you, and that is what truly matters." Benjamin seemed to absorb that profound truth like a sponge, asking no further questions, but simply burying his small face deep into Grace's warm shoulder as she seamlessly transitioned into reading a comforting tale about a frightened rabbit who discovered courage in the dark. Matthew retreated quietly back to his desk, hot tears streaming freely down his cheeks, profoundly struck by the realization that Grace was not just an employee, but an indispensable partner in the arduous, terrifying journey of rebuilding a shattered family. As the days bled into weeks, his deep, platonic admiration slowly morphed into an overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful romantic infatuation. He found himself constantly searching for her bright smile, his heart violently skipping a beat whenever their hands accidentally brushed while passing plates across the kitchen island. He initially tried to aggressively suppress this blooming affection, terrified that romantic complications would shatter the fragile peace they had built, deeply fearful of crossing the boundary between an employer and the woman saving his children. But attempting to push those feelings away was like trying to hold back the ocean tide with his bare hands. The thoughts returned with a staggering ferocity, aggressively invading his corporate meetings as he found himself daydreaming about the exact pitch of her laughter, or rushing through Seattle traffic with a desperate, burning anxiety just to see her face again. Late one Tuesday evening, long after the heavy breathing of the sleeping twins filled the quiet house, Matthew and Grace sat closely together at the kitchen island, sharing a steaming pot of herbal tea as had become their cherished nightly ritual. They effortlessly conversed about the mundane, beautiful details of their day, debating weekend plans and laughing until their stomachs ached about Benjamin's hilarious, doomed attempt to teach the neighbor's golden retriever how to jump rope in the driveway. In the midst of that warm, lingering laughter, Matthew caught himself staring at her face for several seconds longer than was socially acceptable, entirely captivated by the way the dim kitchen light danced across her bright, expressive eyes. Grace caught the intense, burning weight of his gaze, and the laughter slowly died on her lips, replaced by a sudden, heavy, deeply charged silence that hung thickly between them. A silence not born of awkwardness, but deeply saturated with massive, unspoken truths that demanded to be dragged into the light. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice trembling as she used his first name for the absolute first time since stepping foot in his house, sending an intense electric shiver violently cascading down the entire length of his spine. I really need to tell you something." He nodded mutely, his mouth suddenly incredibly dry, fully expecting the worst, but simultaneously hoping for the absolute best, his heart hammering against his ribcage like a trapped bird as he waited for her to bridge the terrifying gap between them. Grace took a massive, shuddering breath, visibly gathering every single ounce of courage she possessed in her soul, her hands gripping the warm ceramic mug so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. "I am fully aware that this might be wildly inappropriate, and I know that I am technically employed by you, but I simply cannot continue to swallow these feelings anymore," she began, her voice cracking under the immense emotional weight. "I have become so deeply, irrevocably attached to the boys, and to you, far more profoundly than I ever should have allowed, and it is tearing me apart, because I am absolutely terrified of ruining this beautiful life we have created." Matthew sat completely paralyzed, the air completely knocked out of his lungs, because she was bravely speaking the exact, terrifying words that had been echoing inside his own mind for weeks, words he had been too cowardly to articulate out of fear of making them terrifyingly real. "Grace, he desperately tried to interject, wanting to instantly validate her terrifying vulnerability, but she quickly raised a trembling hand, silently pleading with him to let her empty her soul before her courage completely evaporated. He snapped his mouth shut, offering her the silent, respectful space she needed. "Please, just let me finish before I completely lose my nerve," she begged, a single, silver tear escaping the corner of her eye and sliding down her flushed cheek. "I know you are still healing from the massive trauma Jessica left behind, and I know the boys complicate everything, but I cannot wake up every single morning and pretend that I am just here to do a job. I care about you, Matthew, so incredibly much, and I am suffocating under the weight of pretending otherwise." She finally finished her confession, her voice a fragile, broken whisper, her brilliant eyes swimming with heavily contained tears that threatened to unleash a massive flood at any given moment. Matthew remained completely silent for several agonizing seconds, his brain rapidly processing the absolute miracle of her reciprocated affection, feeling the chaotic rhythm of his racing heart roaring loudly in his own ears. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed his wooden stool back and stood up, walking around the massive marble island until he was standing directly in front of her. With a tenderness he reserved only for his children, he reached out and gently enveloped her trembling, cold hands within his own warm palms, treating them like the most precious, fragile porcelain in the entire universe. "You are not being ridiculous, Grace. Not even for a single fraction of a second," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a deep, unmistakable emotion that caused her to instantly look up, her eyes searching his face desperately for the truth. "I feel the exact same way. I have fallen so deeply for you, in a way that honestly terrifies me because it happened with the speed of lightning, yet it feels more profoundly correct and natural than anything I have ever experienced in my entire life. It feels like you were always supposed to be here." Grace released a massive, shuddering gasp that was half sob, half laugh, the heavy dam finally breaking as tears of pure, unadulterated relief and joy streamed freely down her face. They stood there in the quiet sanctuary of the kitchen, their hands tightly intertwined, completely engulfed in the terrifying, thrilling realization that they were standing on the precipice of a massive, life-altering journey together. And then, acting on a magnetic pull he could no longer resist, Matthew gently pulled her into a deep, desperate embrace, wrapping his arms securely around her waist, while she buried her tear-stained face into his chest. It was a long, silent hug that effortlessly communicated the thousands of complex emotions they were too overwhelmed to speak. A silent vow that they were both terrified, but undeniably ready to build a magnificent, beautiful future out of the ashes of their pasts. Robert drove to the modest apartment where Lucy and Victoria lived, leaving behind his wealth, status, and pride. When Lucy opened the door in surprise, he stepped inside, found Victoria drawing on the living room floor, and knelt before her to confess who he really was. With tears in his eyes, he apologized for taking so long to find her, and asked for a chance to make things right. After a long silence, Victoria showed him the picture she had drawn, called First Meeting, and quietly said she would give him an opportunity because she believed people who cried honestly were capable of true love. 2 weeks later, the family gathered for a hopeful dinner at the Blackwood estate, where Victoria's small chair took a place of honor, while Arthur's memory was respectfully preserved. The next morning, Helen, Robert, Lucy, and Victoria planted a new rose bush beside Arthur's roses, and Victoria proudly named it New Beginnings. Months later, when it finally bloomed, she completed her drawing to show all 4 of them together and titled it The Family We Choose to Plant, symbolizing the bonds they had chosen to build. As time passed, the growing rosebush reflected the healing of the once broken family. Their story proved that past mistakes do not have to define the future, and that true family is built through love, forgiveness, honesty, and daily commitment rather than blood alone. Just as a garden needs patience and care to flourish, the human heart heals through trust and steadfast presence, reminding us that it is never too late to replace regret with reconciliation and leave behind a legacy of enduring compassion and chosen love.